Today, the world's largest economy and second most powerful country is the People's Republic of China. China is a totalitarian country where political nonconformity is crushed and power is held by the elites of the Communist Party. But what if China wasn't communist? What if it was a democracy? Well, in order for this to happen, we have to go back to the Chinese Civil War. Back in the 1920s, the newfound Chinese Republic was divided between a dozen different powerful warlords. But by the end of that decade, the forces of the Kuomintang, the nationalist party, united China under its hegemony. The head of the KMT was General Chiang Kai-shek. While he planned to bring China eventually to democracy, he believed that authoritarian rule was a necessary first step. Chiang also hated the Chinese Communist Party. Once done with the warlords, he targeted the communists, launching attacks and killing tens of thousands of leftists in brutal purges. The communists were almost destroyed, but fled in the Long March to a distant province outside of KMT control. Meanwhile, Japan invaded China, occupying the northern provinces of Manchuria. In 1936, Japan attacked again with the goal of quickly conquering the whole of the country. Though Japan provided a greater danger, Chiang refused to make peace with the communists until one of his leading generals kidnapped him. Held hostage, he agreed to an alliance. Over the next few years, the KMT and the communists fought in a united front against Japan's invasion. The war was brutal, with Japan murdering millions of civilians. Meanwhile, the KMT itself employed brutal tactics to ward off Japan's march, like flooding the Yellow River and causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands. Ultimately, Japan bit off more than it could chew. It attacked America. By 1945, the US surrounded Japan and dropped nuclear bombs on two major cities. And shortly afterward, the USSR invaded Manchuria. Japan surrendered. However, fighting wasn't over in China. Now with Japan defeated, the KMT and the communists promptly turned their guns on each other again. The nationalist government, exhausted from bearing the brunt of the fighting, and with most Western aid embezzled in corruption schemes, was unable to stop the communist advance. So the communists conquered the mainland and established a dictatorship under Mao Zedong, while Chiang Kai-shek and his allies escaped to the island of Taiwan. To this day, mainland China is controlled by the communists, but Taiwan has since become a democracy. How could it have gone differently? Well, China's best chance for democracy lay with the KMT. Despite being an authoritarian ruler, Chiang Kai-shek was committed, in principle, to transitioning his country to democracy. While both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong died at about the same time, communist rule rejected democracy in its totality, so no transition occurred in mainland China. Meanwhile, Taiwan has become a functioning democracy. Now, that wouldn't have happened in mainland China if the KMT ruled. We can see similar trends in countries such as South Korea and the Philippines, whose right-wing dictatorships gradually transitioned into, albeit flawed, democracies. So, could Chiang Kai-shek have won the Chinese Civil War? Well, he almost did in real life. In 1934, KMT soldiers surrounded the Communist Army and were preparing to assault their capital. However, a spy learned of the KMT plans and brought them to the Communists, who then fled and escaped destruction. Let's say this spy gets figured out, gets arrested. The plan never then leaks to the Communists, who are completely blockaded and then defeated. Communist guerrillas keep fighting for years to come without a doubt, but with the loss of their largest army, they are not a major factor. The war with Japan happens like real life, though maybe the KMT performs better at the beginning. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, America hops across the Pacific, and Japan ultimately loses. The USSR in this scenario occupies northern China like in real life. So what happens then? Well, the Soviet Union would not turn over communist areas in the far west, Mongolia and Manchuria to KMT rule, despite relatively friendly relations with Chiang Kai-shek. Instead, it would give power to the weakened Chinese communists, who become Soviet puppets kind of like Poland. Now with a base in the north, Mao Zedong launches attacks against the KMT government. However, with fewer people to recruit from, these attacks are repelled, with a UN-negotiated ceasefire in, let's say, 1950, splitting the country in half. The north to the communists, and the south to the KMT. Korea sees a similar fate, with communists ruling in the north and conservatives in the south. Now, in real life, North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, triggering the Korean War. The Soviet Union was boycotting the United Nations at the time, so the Security Council unanimously voted to send soldiers to help South Korea. While UN forces conquered most of the north, Communist China invaded with a million-man army and pressed back the UN. This would happen a lot differently if the Communists lost their civil war. For one, the USSR probably wouldn't have boycotted the UN, since it did so to try to get Mao Zedong China's seat. In any case, American, British, and South Korean forces repel the North Korean invasion. Then Mao Zedong attempts to help the North like in real life, but in this scenario he's too weak to make a difference. So Communist North Korea is dismantled and doesn't exist for a long time. Over the next several years, both China and Manchuria industrialized through government-led efforts. Chiang Kai-shek was suspicious of Western imperialism, so he likely would have limited American economic involvement to aid and trade. Instead, the government gives new industrial magnates, called Kaifa, dominion over the reconstruction and industrialization of China. Chiang Kai-shek would probably focus primarily on rebuilding the Chinese army, hoping to reconquer communist-held lands. Meanwhile, absolute political power is held by the KMT, which bans rival political parties and murders thousands of suspected communists and conducts sham elections. This white terror would define Chinese history during the 1950s and 60s. The same sort of thing happened in Taiwan, South Korea, and Indonesia in real life. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong conducts a parallel campaign of political purge in the north. Native Manchurians are repressed in favor of the Han people, while the Japanese population is probably expelled in its entirety. Anyone who does not follow Mao is blindly imprisoned and brainwashed, and desperate attempts to catch up with the South result in widespread famine. Modernization, or at least Mao's version, marches on over the bodies of hundreds of thousands of victims. When it comes to foreign policy, northern communist China would probably be locked to the USSR, while the Republic of China in the south would align more with the United States. Border disputes occurred in real life between China and India, so those would happen in this scenario as well. However, with the Republic as a staunch US ally, India is then pushed closer to the Soviet Union, but it never full-heartedly adopts communism. In turn, China forms a lasting alliance with Muslim countries to the south, like Pakistan and Myanmar. The Republic, meanwhile, imposes its rules over Tibet. Soviet troops are stationed in Mongolia, Manchuria, and Xinjiang in the far west, while the Great Wall of China is reconstructed into a vast demilitarization zone complete with barbed wire and mines. The Republic also develops nuclear weapons in the 1960s, thanks to US help. Now, since China and Korea didn't fall to communism in this timeline, the US is much less paranoid about the threat of Soviet world domination. The Cold War is probably still intense, but there's weaker public support for large-scale US intervention in cases such as Vietnam. As a result, US presence remains small in that country and mostly advisory in character like the early stages of the war. South Vietnam then falls in the mid-1960s because of its political instability. Now in real life, Chiang Kai-shek invaded North Vietnam and occupied it before agreeing to retreat back in 1946. China likely opposes the rise of communism in Vietnam, but doesn't launch any large-scale invasion to actually do anything about it. The two countries likely fight a small skirmish in the early 1970s with no clear winner. Something similar happened in real life. In Vietnam, conservative forces probably continue fighting a guerrilla war against the Vietnamese government until the end of the Cold War, when a peace treaty is agreed to and elections are held, kind of like Nicaragua in real life. Now, Chiang Kai-shek died in the year 1975, and Mao Zedong died the next year. It's impossible to know for sure, but let's say the two dictators die in about the same period in this scenario. That opens up the pathway for both countries to moderate their policies. In the Republic, a constitution is promulgated and emergency power is limited, though the KMT holds power for several more years thanks to rigged elections. A loosening of government control in the economy allows for the escalation of economic development. Meanwhile, North China ends the Mao cult of personality and loosens Communist Party domination. The 1970s are imperfect, but they signify the beginning of democracy in the two Chinese countries. In the South, the loosening of KMT domination only encourages greater criticism of the government. Meanwhile, the economic liberalization allows the Chinese elite to grow richer at the cost of the middle class. Because of this, the 1980s see a huge wave of protests in major cities like Nanking and Beijing. By the end of that decade, the KMT has submitted to the inevitable and agrees to relinquish its absolute control over politics. In 1987, elections are held, and the KMT loses to an alliance of left-wingers and moderates. Meanwhile, liberalization in the north threatens continued communist rule. The Soviet Union at the same time liberalizes as well, promising to no longer use armed force to uphold foreign communist governments. As protest spreads quickly across the north, the communist regime crumbles and its leaders flee. An interim government signs a document reunifying with the South in the year 1989. Over the next 20 years, a liberalized China rises to economic prominence, kind of like Japan in the 1990s. Chinese culture and media become popular across the world, while the country is recognized as a superpower and the chief American ally. Mongolia and Uyghuristan are likely independent countries, though fall under deep economic influence by China. Maybe they're annexed at a later point. Now, this world wouldn't be perfect. China and India would both be nuclear-armed rivals, while a resurgent Russian nationalism would challenge the post-Cold War liberal world order. However, with the US and China aligned for the most part, the two strongest countries of the world would be friendly competitors, not staunch rivals. The people of China would be better off too. While the Cold War years were often bloody, they weren't as bad as if Mao Zedong ruled the whole country. The repression we see in China today would be mostly gone as well, and China would be much more prosperous overall without the Communist Party breathing down the neck of the middle class and entrepreneurs. China in this situation would be like South Korea or Japan, but with a much larger population. But what do you think would happen? Would the Republic of China eventually democratize, or would the KMT and the military hold on to power? Would China be a prosperous country? Comment below what you think about this scenario, or if you have future recommendations. And if you like this video and want to see more, don't forget to subscribe.